Good morning. Hopefully everyone is doing good this morning. Thank you for your patience as we're figuring out the tech component in this room. My name is Dr. Brandeis Marshall, as it says on the screen. I am originally from Ohio, so I'm LeBron James all day long, no matter what team he's on. And I'm currently living here in Atlanta, and I own Data edX Group. And it's really a firm in order to talk through and help practitioners, scholars, and educators in data ethics. What to do, how to do it, what are the challenges, what are the tensions, how to move forward, all right? And I'm also here in order to talk a little bit about this thing that I've been doing for about 2 years that happens to be a book. So I dropped my first book. It is Data Conscience, Algorithmic Siege on Our Humanity. And so that's what I'm going to talk a little bit about today. I'm going to give you a little bit of an overview of the book, as well as talk about one of the particular chapters, which I titled Bias. All right. If you have not already, I'm doing a book signing right after this. So you're happy to buy a book here for $29. So it's a little bit of a discount that it is on Amazon and all the other resources. Okay. All right. Let me get started, I guess. All right. So this is a story about tag. I had to go back to like when I was a kid in order to start this story. I love giving stories when I talk about data because data can be super, super dry because people love to talk about visualization. People love to talk about the pretty pictures. People love to talk about analytics. People love to talk about getting into the field, but don't really actually want to talk about what happens when it goes wrong. All right, so it's just a little story about tag. And what do I mean by tag? Yeah, you're it. And so when it comes to tag, there's 3 components that I really talk about in my book. The first one is transparency. And when it comes to transparency, there are several different definitions of transparency. And but I give a different definition, right? So my definition is transparency is revealing outcomes and impact of data, code, and algorithms, all 3, by companies, organizations, and groups. So that means anybody that has to deal with data, right? And so right now, the public is very incensed and intense and putting pressure to have more transparency. We all want to know what's happening to our own data. How is it navigating through all of the digital infrastructures? And then how is it targeted? How are we targeted as a result? And all these questions. So that's the transparency component. The second component is accountability. That's the A. And when it comes to accountability, of course, there's a lot of different definitions, but I'm going to give you mine, because since I have the floor. So mine is the act of holding organizations responsible for the consequences of their AI system failures. What does that look like? What does responsibility actually look like? And what is the process inside of these digital systems to actually hold them responsible? Okay, because accountability means that they know that it's wrong. Responsible means they actually are taking some action in order to reduce the harms that's invoked, right? So more and more people like yourselves in the data and tech community are actually like, okay, the nature of my work may be causing some harm. So maybe I want to do some things in order to mitigate that harm. And what do I do? And how do I do it? How do I talk about it? How do I approach it, right? And then the last, but certainly not the least, happens to be governance. And governance, well, causes some friction because people are like, should government be involved? Should it not be involved? Should it just be corporations? How do we do this, right? But to me, when it comes to governance, governance by my definition is the administration of equity and decency. What does that mean? When things are equitable, what does it mean to actually center decency of humanity? Right? So that means the government, legal systems, as well as right now a lot of policymakers, some politicians, depending on the day and where the wind blows, are trying to actually establish some enforceable, possibly punitive legal guardrails with financial repercussions. Right? That's what's happening sort of kind of right now. But what happens in all of this between the T, the A, and the G is what's happening in our society, especially here in the United States, is that all are happening all the time, and it's like full force ahead. We're trying to do transparency, accountability, and governance, but there's a problem. The problem is that no one's really talking to each other. So the people that are trying to be transparent, so the people, the general population, doesn't really know what's happening when it comes to the tech and data professionals and what they're implementing and doing, or the leadership within organizations, teams, and groups, right? And then there is, of course, the government, and the government is instilling proposals and approaches that aren't necessarily in alignment with what's actually doable or feasible within the digital realm. So let me say that more candidly. Lawyers don't understand tech. Tech don't understand lawyers. And they're both talking about algorithms. And no one understands algorithms unless you probably were in computing and taking some type of computing class, and you actually understand what an algorithm is and how it works and how it's very limiting. So all of these things mean that we have a new reckoning, right? Post George Floyd, they're still in this endemic thing, right? So everyone's concentrating on figuring out how to do all three of these things in their separate lanes. And of course, the approach right now is to concentrate on one goal. And the one goal is trying to figure out how to mitigate bias, right? And mitigating bias, first it was talked about as, oh, we're just trying to fix bias. I immediately was like, no, we can't fix bias because we have to understand what bias is. There's multiple definitions of bias. There's a whole sets of websites that go through all the different types of bias. So here are two types of bias that I have on the screen. The first one happens to be confirmation bias. So in the statistical realm, there's confirmation bias, there's sampling bias, there's all these other types. There's like 150 different types of bias that's within the statistical realm, right? Then there is the societal types of bias, right? And that's where you understand the aggressions, right? So on the screen is a little GIF of microaggressions that you're seeing on the screen. I don't believe in microaggressions. There's just aggressions and then there's not aggressions. Nothing's micro about them, nothing's macro about them. They're all just aggressions. So then what do we do in order to distinguish between these two? And then as everyone in the world in some capacity is trying to either get transparency, try to implement accountability, or trying to create laws in order to actually have some governance around mitigating this bias, because we can't fix it. We can only reduce it, right? So where I want to start is giving some formal definitions, right? I talked through them, but I was going to give the formal definitions of what bias is to me. Right. So the first set of bias definition is all about the statistics, right? It's how do you deal with error within some mathematical formula. For those of us that have been through many math classes, many computing classes, many engineering classes, we know this as epsilon. How big is your epsilon? What's your threshold, right? And that happens to be where most people within the tech realm want to concentrate, is what statistically is the error. So we can see this in p-value. I know there's a lot of conversation about p-value, if p-values are valuable or not, but here's just one example, p-value. What is the significance range that you're in? What's the confidence of the significance, right? The second set of biases that I concentrate mostly on happens to deal with societal inequities and systemic type of inequities that we see in our world, right, to people who are historically excluded, right? So I'll pause here and say I say historically excluded groups and communities. I don't say underrepresented. As someone who is not under anything, and I'm a minority of nothing, right? So I consider myself historically excluded in systems, processes, right? So definition 2, of course, has to deal with societal inequities. And what does that mean structurally? So I'm talking through what's happening socially, economically, politically, and computationally. Right? So that's a lot of competing priorities, right? You come in, it was fine. All right, so for example, we've seen these quite a bit in the past few years when it comes to mortgage lending, when it comes to criminal justice reform or non-reform, when it comes to, of course, standardized testing, when it comes to income tax, and there's many, many other different examples of where we see structural inequities and where bias can exist. And what has happened in our world is that there has been a brick wall between the two. People talk about statistical error as bias, and that's somehow separate from the societal biases and inequities. And no one want to talk about the fact that both things can be true at the same time. And in fact, they feed off each other, right? So I'm just gonna make this, hopefully bring this home a little bit when it comes to bias, right? Is that we do have the statistical biases, we do have the societal biases as well. We have this brick wall in the middle. And what I propose within my book, in one of the chapters, is that there's a framework. It was this obscure blog from Garner from like 2 or 3 years ago. And I kind of liked it, but I think it needed a little bit of a twist. It needed a little Brandeis-like zhuzh put on top of it. And so they had 4 different types of biases. I've kind of relabeled them, but these are essentially what the 4 are. There's 2 within the digital space that I call the digital space. There's 2 within what I call the analog space or in real life space. The 2 in the digital space are data bias and, of course, algorithmic bias. So most of us have heard these 2 terms quite a bit over the past few years. They've become kind of popular now. So the whole point of data bias is how is data itself incomplete? So really conversations about data quality and integrity and how that is not necessarily as value add as possible, right? That's what data biases look at. Then there's algorithmic biases. And algorithmic biases are really talking about how algorithms themselves can output different, let's say, exploitations of how the algorithms can leverage the data in bad ways, right? So algorithms themselves have some challenges. Then in real life space, there's 2 other types of biases. The first one happens to be human. That's all of us. We come with a certain notion of what we expect the world to see and how we see the world, right? And so we put that into the actual systems. And then there is the business biases. The business biases are all based upon capitalism, right? What's the ROI? What are the KPIs, right? Return on investment and key performance indicators, right? How do you make money? How do you make a profit out of things? So I put these strategically around the brick wall because some are closer to the brick wall than others, right? This is just my interpretation. But how do we see this, right? And so what I propose is what's called the bias wheel, and it's a framework. And I'm actually talking about a real wheel. And so why I have a real wheel is because of how a wheel works. Okay, so I'm gonna go a little bit car on y'all, but I'm not a real car person. I like pretty cars, but I don't know all the mechanics of a car. So if y'all are car people, just trust me. I don't know what I'm talking about other than what's on the screen. Okay. So the basic wheel has a couple of components, right? That component includes the center cap, the spokes, and a rim, right? How the wheel operates. Then there is the forward motion and backward motion of the wheel. We're going to talk about just forward motion for this particular example. And then what happens when it comes to forward motion is that the spokes are now dealing with all of the pressure, and then that pressure is distributed around the other spokes and the wheel as you're doing this forward motion, right? So this is what I'm showing here, is that as you rotate around this wheel, each spoke is now, centering what happens to have the pressure, right? What's at the top is what is most biggest priority, and that impact is impacting everything else, the other spokes and the other part of the wheel. So I've labeled them 1, 2, 3, 4. And then, of course, what will happen when you blow this out and relate this directly to all the biases that I'm talking through is that these biases now are part of this wheel. With each bias can be a priority at any point in time, but with each bias, that means that there is a cascading effect to the other biases that are not considered. So that brick wall that I talked about earlier, that you saw earlier, is something that needs to be disbanded altogether. Because this is what's happening, right? So I have 4 examples here where there's different biases as the very first position at the very north or at the very top, and then how it impacts that rotation moving forward. And you can really swap out any of the biases in any of the positions in order to actually see, and hopefully you'll understand that there are these tensions and these impacts that we don't consider, that we need to consider more. So anytime someone talks about algorithmic bias, I immediately have questions that are in the other 4 realms, right? Because I now want to know more deeply what's happening in algorithmic bias. How are they understanding it? How are they explaining it? And then I also want to understand what was the precipice for that bias. What's happening on the data? What's happening when it comes to the humans that actually were part of that system? And then what is the business acumen coming in that's impacting the human and the data and the algorithmic considerations, right? That's where my questions all come from. So yes, this is a different approach, a different way in order to think about it. But then as a tech person, as a data person, the question is always, oh, what do we do? This is a good framework, but this is not concrete enough. How do we start? We can't do anything. Okay, I'm sorry, I'm being overdramatic, but that's literally what happens inside of team meetings. I don't know about you, but that's what I've heard. We don't know how to handle this. What's the mathematical formula that we can implement and try this out? It happens to be part of the questions. Okay, so where should we start? I say we start with the why questions. But why questions cause much tension and friction inside of organizations, right? As people who are data workers or possibly team leaders, why questions get people a little ruffled in their feathers. So I've set up 3 questions. I'm giving 2 today, but 3 questions that aren't why directly. They're sort of why adjacent, so to speak, in order to try to get at the why, right? All right, so here's the first question that most people are like, yeah, of course, this would be a good question to ask. So the first question is, does the data we need already exist? And this gets into a longer conversation, typically takes several iterations in order to talk through, if the team is actually having a candid conversation, right? So what to do? Yes, if the answer is yes, you have what you need. Okay, then let's talk a little bit more. Where is it coming from, right? What was its purpose? Because us in the tech and data realms love to repurpose data for not good repurposed purposes. Did I say that nice enough? Okay. So we have to be candid about whether or not we're trying to use primary data, secondary data, or tertiary data, and be honest about that. Because sometimes the data that we're trying to use isn't fit for the thing that we're trying to implement. And we need to reconsider how we're doing that. And there's other times we've collected a whole bunch of data and have not filtered it out. So we haven't actually polished it in a way that actually would make sense in order to use it in the way in which we're trying to design this new system for. So let's be candid and real about it. All right, that's if the answers to this is yes, yes. What happens if it's no? Secondary questions. All right, more questions. And these questions are, what is the gathering process? How are you collecting the actual data? How is it going to be used? And then, what are you thinking about the harms that you are creating? Have you thought through what those harms might be? If you're like, oh, I don't understand, what do you mean by harms? How do we assess that? Well, guess what? Dr. Timney Gibru has put together data sheets. And data sheets has a lovely set of questions that's already been published that you can use as a very first step, right? So there's things you can do, action items that you can actually do in order to figure out the question, the answers to some of these questions, right? That's documented and measurable and actionable. All right, so this is one question. Where do we start? The second question that I want to bring up is the one that always gets people a little like, wait, what? What are we doing? Wait, hold up. You're hitting too close to home here, Dr. Marshall. So do we own the rights to the data? And this is a question that is currently under a lot of legal scrutiny, because who owns the data? So if you give data to a company, does the company own the data, or do you as the individual own the data? Right? And legally, what is the decision? And then there's morally, what is the decision? Right? Because if you go on right now and you want to download all of your tweets, that's not your data, because you have to request your tweets. And they give it to you within, 24 to 48 hours. But if something happens in that 24 to 48 hours, you don't get your tweets, right? On every other platform, same thing. You have to request your data, right? So who owns it? And then the question is, after who owns it, is what do they do with it? Can they resell it? Do they resell it? Do you have a choice on whether or not they resell it? So you're sitting in a data team, you're asking this question, who owns the data? Do you as an organization, do you as the team have access to this data? Then there's questions about, oh, well, okay, we do own the data. You guys say you own the data. Okay, great, carry on, continue. But be careful, because you don't want to get in a situation that Facebook got in a couple of years ago, where they, quote unquote, own the data. But of course, programmers wanted to test out new features and functionalities. So they just went ahead and just scooped a bunch of user profiles and passwords and put it into an Excel spreadsheet, and then had that Excel spreadsheet get released. Yeah, that happened about 7 years ago. This is just an example of what happens if you do, quote, own the data, right? You have to be responsible with that data. What is the accountability for making sure that the team does not use that data inappropriately, even within the organization? What would be the point of grabbing real people's data and their passwords and putting them into an Excel spreadsheet? You're supposed to create dummy data and do the testing on the dev side. Hello, isn't that like software engineering 101? But somehow they didn't do that. I don't know, they're just a $1 trillion company. Okay, all right, so that's a yes, you can carry on, but of course be responsible. And then of course there is no. That means you're gonna need to stop. And you're gonna need to you need to purchase some stuff, reassess some things, stop completely, don't continue going, right? Talk to upper management, figure out what are really the next step, maybe talk to a data governance team to figure out what are next steps to make sure that you're in compliance and that you are actually protecting consumers' data and also protecting yourself, right, in this situation. Okay, so these are two of the three questions that I ask on how to even get started. This is just data collection. I have other questions that I have put down inside of the book, as well as what are some responses that you might want to consider. Yes, no, maybe so, right? And I go through this as why questions, what questions, and then how questions, right? Because that is the way we need to start to think through. as people within this field, we tend to think a lot about how and what, and we do the why last. And that's why I wanted to start with the why questions first. Why are we doing this? And then go to what we're doing, and then going to actually how we're going to facilitate it. All right, so as a recap, because I know time is limited, this is just a little bit of what I've been through, high-level slides of what I've covered. This is a story about TAG, transparency, accountability, and governance, and what does that mean? How do we mitigate bias? Because of right now, it is a top concern for all people, and it's actually in the spotlight. So let's now try to actually make something happen within the digital sphere so that it, of course, can impact how our humanity can be better represented inside of digital systems, right? Please adopt the bias wheel. Take it back to your organizations to actually have these conversations. How does the company work through their data policies inside the company? Because a data policy tends to be for external uses. But how does the data policies work within the organization? That's another good place to start. All right. And then last but not least, make sure you ask the why-ish questions as you go through. So with that, I want to say thank you for your time and your attention. I'm open up for questions. And as I said earlier at the very top of this, the book signing is happening directly after this upstairs, right at 11 o'clock. So thank you. Yay. And I didn't take all 45 minutes. So any questions anyone have for me? Yes.
I really enjoyed your talk. Thank you so much. I love the why-ish questions. It is sometimes hard just to start with why, so I appreciate that very much.
Thank you. Anyone have any questions for me? Yes, go ahead.
I have a question.
Yeah.
Hey, my name's Kevin, everybody. I'm with MailChimp. My question is, a lot of this talk is based from the perspective of the company as the potential owner of the data that they collect.
Correct.
Would you have thoughts or recommendations on what somebody on the outside would do, a user of the product, how they would try to safeguard their data, and what responsibilities one might have to avoid problems?
I have lots of thoughts. I have lots of thoughts on that. That's what I do inside of my newsletter. So first off, I think that there needs to be, for people to understand and get some data literacy, so that's the first step. And that does mean understanding how your devices work. So later on in the book, I believe it's chapter 11, the last chapter, I talk through a different orientation about, data and you, and then talking about data at home, what's happening between you and your family, then data when it comes to the workplace, then it comes to your community, and then of course society. So that conversation is first off, understand what's going on with your device. How are you engaging with that device? What are your usernames and your passwords? Making sure to shut down any type of location services. Understanding the ideas around how much data you're actually putting out there. Knowing that when you're engaging with platforms that it is out. There's nothing you can get back afterward. So I very much talk about protecting your likeness online within that. So that's where I think people need to start, is protecting their likeness. So every time I do a talk, every time I am out and about, I'm very conscious of, can I get that video? And things like that. And that does translate for parents and children. So parents need to be understanding that children need to understand that their likeness, they have the ownership to say, I want that video of myself, and then to get it. So that's where I would start that conversation. And unfortunately, companies that I've dealt with in the past have been very, what's the politically right word to say? They have been very strict on whether or not I can get my own likeness. They say, it's going to be on YouTube. Right, can I get the raw video? And that's where they don't want me to get the raw video. So that's the reason why I focus so much on companies, because I need companies to understand that, hey, people are going to get more literate in the data realm, and they're going to be asking for their own ish back. So companies need to be prepared to give people their own stuff. So I know that went a couple of different directions, but do you have a follow-up?
No, that made a lot of sense.
Okay.
Thank you.
All right. Any other questions, comments, thoughts? Yes, sir.
I have maybe like a follow-up on that one.
Yes.
There's definitely like a power dynamic there.
Yeah.
As far as who owns the data, who has the potential to host and serve all the data and everything. And then when it comes to us as individuals, we have less computational power, less political power, less financial power.
Right.
What are some of the ways that you're thinking about that dynamic changing?
I think that with everybody wanting transparency, it's actually pushing the industry to make it easier for people in order to get their own data and store their own data, right? So yes, these little computers we hold in our pockets, in our hands all the time, have more power and computation, and of course more storage space. So that's one way that we can actually not go everything to the cloud, actually have machines and actually store on the machine. So I'm always a proponent of saying, no, you need a machine with a hard drive so you can store your stuff. That's the primary place, and not rely on the cloud, because the cloud you don't own. And that is where I think we're at this apex now, where people are starting to understand that the cloud is not theirs. The cloud is owned by the companies, right? So what happened about a year ago, Facebook went down for 6 hours? Everybody was like, I can't get to, right? Right, now a lot of colleges have some type of, have their email associated with Microsoft or associated with Google now. And students are very, very comfortable with using the cloud. They don't even understand Microsoft products. But then when they can't get access, or they have so much data that it gets full, they're like, what are we supposed to do? That's why you need a machine, boo-boos, to actually store your data someplace. So we're getting to the place where we have just gone overboard with collecting data and producing data, that people are now hitting brick walls. So now people are like, what are we supposed to do? Get a machine to store your own stuff. We're going back to what happened in the 80s, where everybody had their own silos and local machines. So I think that's where we go. That's where we're going. That's where we're headed. People are not going to be going to the cloud. People are going to say, I need to have my own stuff, right? Even the pictures on my phone, I'm trying to keep it on my machine. I'm not trying to sync it. So people are going to move away from syncing it. And organizations are going to start to really think through, hey, we're collecting a lot of data trash. And so people are going to start to realize, hey, I'm just producing data to produce data. Let me not do that, because I have my own machine and I can only store a certain amount of data on it. So I'm going to be very cautious and concerned about what data I'm actually producing. It's like climate change for the digital realm. Yeah.
But isn't the cloud just the main reason that it's become so popular and we start going in directions due to accessibility from anywhere? Like, if we do store it on our own hard, with the old school way, like the reference,
yeah.
You know, how do we capture that accessibility that we've come so accustomed to as well?
Well, I think there's going to be a hybrid for sure, because you can't go back in time. I'm just saying that people have gone, I think they've over-indexed into the cloud, that everything that they have, their whole lives are in the cloud, right? And I think that now it's going to rear back. The pendulum is more going to be balanced now versus everything in the cloud. Yeah, that's where I think it's going to go, because there's only so much. Yeah, not exclusively cloud. And a lot of the younger generation, and even my generation is very much into like, oh, it's on the cloud. I can just access it through OneDrive or Google Drive or whatever. And now it's going to be like, no, I need to think about it, because there's also security challenges with using the cloud. If you send a Google Doc, that person could copy that Google Doc. That's an issue that's happening within hiring practices. Hey, send me your answers to these questions, and they'll send you a Google Doc. And then you're now working on a shared Google Doc with this potential employer. You give them a bunch of ideas. They can then download the ideas and use them and not pay you a thing. And we've seen that happen within the tech space already, right? So there's security and accessibility that we need to counterbalance. And so everyone understanding the pros and the cons of our technological world is something that I'm talking through, right? So the whole, tech will fix everything banner. I'm like, no, I'm critical of that. Like, tech doesn't fix everything. Tech fix some things and then create other issues. And we need to talk about what those other issues are and then how we move forward. Any other questions? No? Well, thank you. Appreciate it. Just thanks for hanging in there. I know it's early, so I appreciate it. Thank you very much, y'all.